Sullivan. Both Weiss and Sullivan are frequent critics of the modern left's position on identity issues, and in their departure letters, they both describe their publications as a thrill to the rising tide of left-wing censorship sweeping in the country's media. So pretty much what the whole point of this is like, and we did, to a lot of you saw us talk about Barry Weiss's departure letter. We did not do Andrew Sullivan's, but yeah, a critical mass of the staff and management at New York Magazine and Vox Media no longer want to associate with me, Sullivan wrote Friday, which was very, very similar again to what we heard Weiss say. They seem to believe, and this is increasingly the orthodoxy in mainstream media, that any writer not actively committed to critical theory in questions of race, gender, and sexual orientation and gender identity is actively physically harming coworkers merely by existing in the same virtual space. And again, I think I think people should be tolerant to other people's ideas. I think people should definitely be tolerant to other people's ideas, and it's like, unless of course they actively infringe upon someone else's right. I don't think anybody should have to put up with someone belittling their identity and things that they can't change. So, yeah, and calling that stuff out, but to be fair, Andrew Sullivan has had deep ties to people like Charles Murray and Sam Harris, who have kind of are pretty much the modern equivalents of the phrenologists of, shall we say, the late 1800s, early 1900s. So let's see further about this. Sullivan and Weiss are hardly the only ones concerned about this problem. Before them, there was a now infamous letter in Harper's defending free speech, signed by figures ranging from Salman Rushdie to Margaret Atwood to Noam Chomsky. Weiss is also a signatory, as was Vox's Matt Iglesias. Before the Harper letter, there was the Hopkins professor Yasha Monk's creation of a new publication called Persuasion that stands against what Monk sees as rising left-wing illiberalism. These critics are, in general, very sloppy with their terms, and that's something that I think I've noticed a lot. Like, there's been a lot of uses, and there's a lot of been times where like cancel culture has been used to, and I think I find it hard to time. Most of the times, I think the word cancel culture is being used to achieve a political goal, and like there is something inherently political behind it. I don't think you can. I think it's very, very hard to dispute that when you look at the way it's been used in the past. Abstract appeals to free speech and liberal values obscure the fact that what's being debated is not anyone's right to speech, but rather the right to air that speech in specific platforms like the NYT without fear of social backlash. Yet virtually everyone agrees that certain speakers, neo-Nazis, for example, do not deserve a column in the paper of record. The real debate here is not about the principle of free speech, but the much greater question of how we should draw the boundaries. And that's what, I do kind of agree with what he's saying there, because that's kind of, funnily enough, that's kind of what I've been saying. Like, everybody has a line. Everybody has a place where they say, enough is enough. I'm going to draw the line. I'm going to draw the boundaries and say that this person does not deserve to or publicly share said opinion. And I think that's like that line really like you should begin to face like social consequences in the workplace for when you start saying things that are actively, I think, infringing on people's rights. Like some of the things that J.K. Rowling has said about trans people, like if that is a direct assault on the quality of their life and their ability to exist in a workplace and feel like people respect them and people care about them, like, and if that's like legitimately being threatened, then I think that's undisputably a problem. But yeah, what kind of speech should be morally out of bounds? I think that's the big question. What sort of speakers should be excluded from major platforms? When can giving a platform to one kind of person actually make it harder for other people to speak their minds freely? And we have seen, again, a lot of attempts for cancel culture, or to cancel, I guess you could say, from a lot of the same people that we've seen in this letter. For example, Alan Dershowitz has been about how cancel culture and the illiberalism of the left, and him, and also Barry Weiss, and a bunch of other people, and other signees of the letter have been very well known for trying to cancel pro-Palestine speakers. That is probably the biggest use of cancellation that we've seen, and it's a great example of cancellation being used as a political weapon. But he says the real, once we see that these are the issues we're discussing, it becomes quite clear that cancel culture is not the existential threat to free expression it's made out to be. So, yeah, he's saying it's not an existential threat because, and if I'm reading this correctly, it's all about platforms. When can giving a platform, he writes, to one kind of person actually make it harder for other people to speak their minds freely, and what kind of social sanctions, like public shaming or firing, are justified responses to violations of these social norms? So, yeah, questions about the limits of what we should discuss in major publications are important to be sure, and I do think anti-cancelers have marshaled some kind of decent arguments for their approach, and I do agree. I think this guy actually, I do agree with what he's saying. The anti-cancelers and those kind of people, they have marshaled some pretty, sound, I think, logical pushes for their point of view. I think that's definitely been fair, and they have pushed me to challenge my own previously held conceived notions. I'm going to be interviewing Matt Taibbi on Newsflash very, very soon. He has been a guy who has been so instrumental in, I really have been listening to and considering what he's saying because, I mean, some of the stuff, it does make sense. Yeah, so, once we see that these are the issues we're actually discussing becomes good. But debates over speech's boundaries are the kinds of difficult conversations that every liberal society, maybe even every society, grapples with all the time. Canada criminalizes hate speech. Germany bans Holocaust denial, and the United States permits both. Yet no one seriously believes that America is a free society, while the other two somehow have collapsed into liberalism. Yeah, and it comes to where does free speech, where's the boundary, where's the line that is being drawn, and that is the big debate where a bunch of people are going to talk about it. I think some people are more concerned about it. For example, I think Matt Taibbi is more concerned about it, or Taibbi is concerned about it more in the context of how it affects news and news culture and what we see in the journalism industry and the business and stuff like that. And people like Andrew Sullivan and Barry Weiss are probably more concerned about the things that they actually believe. Yeah, so here's the next paragraph. The cancel culture conversation is the same debate around free speech's limits that we've been having over offensive speech for decades, playing out in newsrooms and faculty lounges rather than legislatures. What happens now seems novel because we are currently seeing a wave of social justice activism that seeks to redefine how we understand appropriate debate over these topics, sometimes even pushing to co-sign to the margins views that may have seemed tolerable in the past, and really bring new views in there, like defunding the police, stuff like that. These advocates can and have overreached and should be criticized when they do. But on the whole, their work is aimed not at restricting freedoms, but expanding it, making historically marginalized voices feel comfortable enough to in the public square to be their authentic selves, to exist honestly and speak their own truths. Yeah, and I think that's a big thing. We talked about the other cancel culture letter, the rebuttal letter by younger journalists and people of color who are also journalists, academics, and other people. And I think that's the big thing. The thing that they've been ignoring is there has been a lot of discrimination for years in media jobs, journalism jobs, academic jobs, because people were kind of coming at it from marginalized groups, marginalized perspectives, whatever the case may be. This is not a debate over the value of liberalism and free speech. Liberalism requires placing some boundaries on acceptable speech to function. There is a reason out-and-out racists like Richard Spencer has to be signatories on the Harper's letter. And I mean, I'm sure he would probably sign on to those kind of values because they were just so vague. They were so vague. Yeah. What we talk about when we talk about free speech. In traditional debates about free speech and censorship, the argument isn't typically centered on some kind of authority or power structure doing the censoring. In this case, there's no government entity repressing anyone's speech, which is true. But even in classical treatments of free speech, the state isn't always the villain. In On Liberty, John Stuart Mill's canonical defense of liberalism and free expression, he warns a social tyranny more formidable than many kinds of political oppression is a collectively enforced conformity, which is really what they're talking about here. This kind of, you have to stay to the orthodoxy, and even if you're not, you can be self-censored. You can be pushed. What, just by existing in the place you're existing, like the New York Times, things that you're not supposed to say. Things are going to get you in trouble, and you don't say them. That's really what he's talking about there. Thomas Chatterton Williams, the Harper's columnist who organized the letter, tells me that the initial idea for it arose during conversations about it among a small group of writers and thinkers who shared this kind of Millian concern. While Mill was reacting to the stifling conservatism of Victorian England, his would-be heirs believe it is progressivism, the specifically left-wing views of social justice that is to blame for enslaving the soul of the American intellectual elite. We were all stunned and disturbed by the intolerant, censorious mood setting in cultural and media institutions, Williams said. If you were worried about that chilling force sweeping through your institution but incapable of sticking your neck out, this letter is there to show you that many people are sticking their necks out too. And that was, again, the whole point of people being like, well, these people aren't canceled. They're not suffering any cancel culture. Why did they sign this letter? And that is, of course, the whole point. And that I do really subscribe to is that the whole point of it was they were signing this letter to other people. The reason they felt comfortable signing it was because they have big enough platforms so that they can't be quote-unquote canceled, and they will still be able to share their opinions without any kind of fear of retribution. So, David Shore is a big example. Civis denies, though, that is why he was fired. For the Civis Analytics study, that this if you don't know the study of David Shore, he tweeted out a study on why riots in the 1960s were harmful to the Democratic electoral fortunes as proof that their opponents are growing opposed to the very idea of free speech. Yasha Monk, the professor, the anti-cancel culture professor, says, at the very moment when it would be most important for those who oppose an Napoleon far-right wing to speak with confidence and conviction, these same liberal values are losing their luster among significant parts of the left. Companies and cultural institutions fire innocent people for imaginary offenses. Prominent voices alternate between defending cancel culture and denying its existence. An astonishing number of academics and journalists proudly proclaim that it is time to abandon values like due process and free speech. I have never heard anybody say that. Some of those problems are for real. It's true. For example, employers can't be really too swift to fire people for allegedly offensive behavior. And again, obviously, like if David Shore actually truly was fired, if it comes out like beyond like undeniable proof that he was fired for tweeting at that study, then that's clearly ridiculous. But if you look at what you see here, it's not entirely the same. Other examples are more complicated than they are made out to be. The Harper's letter claims that professors are investigated for quoting works of literature in class, but the actual incident seems to be referring to a white UCLA political science lecturer who repeatedly said the N word while reading MLK's letter from a Birmingham jail aloud. The professor's response to students' distress and anger, according to a letter by UCLA's political science department chair, escalated the situation rather than engaging in thoughtful, open, and discourse that we expect from our faculty. Because the point was like, the students were like, please don't say the N-word. And the guy was like, probably did not have a very good reaction to it. And others are non-controversial, even among left-wing intellectuals. The Shore case is widely seen as an injustice. Contrary to the original letter's claims, what's actually happening here is more than a subtle war. Is more subtle than a war between free speech's defenders and its opponents. It is, as the University of Illinois' Nicholas Grossman writes, an argument over drawing the lines of socially acceptable expression and determining appropriate responses to transgressing those norms. And that's really, I think that's what it is. It's not really the black and white. Like, free speech is great, and the other people on the other side would be like, I hate free speech. And to be quite fair, I'm not really sure that they think it's that either. I'm not really sure that like the Harper's Letter people think it's that. I'm not really sure like Yasha Monk think it's that. But I think that's a great way of looking at it. Like it is the boundaries of it's the boundaries of conversation, the boundaries of what's acceptable and what you can say in public. That is, I think, a big deal, a big part of what we're seeing here in a discussion that I think a lot of people are going to be involved in and will change over time, I think, as culture changes, which is, believe it or not, completely okay and not a big deal and a thing to freak out about. All very, very interesting conversations to be had, not just now, but deep into the future as well. That's all the time we got for us today here on Newsflash episode 317. So just a few quick announcements. Yes, it is true. Matt Taibbi will be joining us on Newsflash in a date to be named later. Very, very excited about that. Also, coming soon. We have a new episode of Uncultured. We'll be able to